I'm Sebastian St. James. What is the best bond ETF for Australians right now? In a previous video, one of my viewers said, "Hi Sebastian, fantastic analysis and great explanations. What a fantastic service you were giving us." Oh, thanks Steve. I may have missed it, but did you do a video on how to buy bonds? It seems very complicated to select the correct one. Thank you again. What a polite man. There are two ways of buying bonds. Method number one is buying bond ETFs. Method number two is buying individual bonds. In this video, we'll cover buying bond ETFs. And in the next video on bonds, we'll cover buying individual bonds. In case you're special and bond ETFs are so last year. But there is a problem. There are too many bond ETFs. That's right, Australia's full of them. So I've narrowed it down to the 11 most popular and we'll decide which is the best. When most people think of bonds, they think of one thing. Oh, the 60-40 portfolio. What does that mean? Well, that means 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Do I recommend a 60-40 portfolio? No, I definitely don't. But it is the trope. 60-40. So whenever I mention it, that's what I'm referring to. The classic 60-40 portfolio. And it's definitely not a recommendation from me. The question is, what is made up by that 40% in bonds? Is that 40% in strictly government bonds? Or can you include corporate bonds as well? And must it be the bonds from the country in which you're living? Because, there's no currency risk then. Or should you actually diversify it internationally? The answer to that question is yes, to all of those. When people say 60-40, they don't really mean a particular type of bonds. They mean bonds as a class. So what you buy in bonds is entirely up to you. It really depends on what direction you want to take with your bonds. But as a general principle, diversification can actually help. Step number one, look for bonds that are based on index funds. Step number two, look for bonds that have also government bonds and corporate bonds in the one ETF. That can be very helpful. And why not look for bonds which also have domestic and international? That way you're buying bonds in general, right across the board, lots of diversification, but you can specialize if you want to, including having no bonds at all. Yes, that's an entirely valid way of investing, and you'll find out at the end exactly what I mean by that. This is IAF. That's the iShares Core Composite Bond ETF. It has a management fee of 0.1%. Composite. What does that mean? Well, if it's a composite material, it means more than one material stitched together. Is that what a bond composite fund is? Yes, it's exactly the same. Basically, it is government bonds and corporate bonds in the one fund. Composite. But there is something you need to know about composite bonds that most people don't even realise. This is the index composition of the Australian Composite Bond Index and, oh, hang on. It's mostly all the one colour. Yes, that is government bonds. 90% of this so-called composite index is not really composite at all. It's just straight up government bonds. Why is this? Well, it actually comes from the principle on how they choose their bonds. Think of it this way. ASX 200, what is that based on? Oh, that's market cap weighted. Yes, it is. So the size of the company determine how much of the percentage each company gets of the index. Bonds, are they market cap weighted based on the size of the company that issues them? No, they're definitely not. Bond index funds tend to be weighted on the amount of debt that is issued. Who issues the most debt? Is it BHP? No, the Australian government. So there you go. So that's why all your composite index funds mostly are government debt. The fund aims to provide investors with the performance of Bloomberg AusBond Composite 0+ Year Index before fees, expenses, etc. Now, what do they invest in? Investment-grade fixed income securities issued by the Australian Treasury, Australian semi-government entities, supranational and sovereign entities, and corporate entities. Oh, that's a mouthful. So, what does all this mean? Treasury means federal government. Other government bodies can be state governments. In theory, it could be municipalities as well, councils, it depends. But that's what it means. So government bonds in general means the whole kit and caboodle. Treasuries, no, that's just at the top. In a sense, treasuries are actually safer than government bonds because the government can always raise taxes, whereas the states and other government bodies probably can't. What does supranatural mean? Is that means full of magic? No, that's supernatural. It's not related. Supranatural actually means crossing national borders. Sometimes countries actually set up institutions that actually belong to both countries, more or less. It's supranatural. And they can issue bonds, and these bond funds can invest in them. So we add to our list. IAF, the fee is 0.1%. Australian government bonds, yes. Australian corporate bonds, yes. International, no. Now, in that, I'm not differentiating between Treasury versus government, right? Something we'll be here all day if we make that sort of distinction. So government, which means the whole thing. Corporate obviously means bonds, which are issued by companies. And sometimes local bonds actually are issued from entities overseas. But as long as they're actually issued on the Australian market, then they become a part of the Australian bonds. On the other hand, we may go to the US market and actually look at US bonds or international bonds. But if we're talking about local bonds, we can also be talking about foreign entities. This is BOND. This is the SPDR S&P ASX Australian Bond Fund. It has a management fee of 0.24%. Its benchmark is the S&P ASX Australian Fixed Interest Index. It has access to high quality according to it. Okay, so bonds are actually graded AAA, BBB, things like that. It provides access to government and semi-government, we know what that means, and corporate bonds issued in Australia. So there you go, its fee is 0.24% and, well, it's government and corporate, isn't it? And no international. This is VAF, which is the Vanguard Australian Fixed Interest Index. It has a management fee of 0.15%. Notice its indirect cost is 0. That's important. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Its benchmark is the Bloomberg AusBond Composite 0+ Year Index. I've noticed something sinister about Bloomberg lately. They seem to be buying up all the indices. So some of these indices that we're now talking about used to be Barclays. But now what's happened is they've been bought up. So there's been a fundamental shift in who's owning the indices at the moment. The ETF invests in high-quality, income-generating securities, right, of the Commonwealth Government of Australia, state governments, treasury corporations, investment-grade corporate. Okay, so we understand what's going on there. So, VAF, its fee of 0.15%, and it's a yes, no on where it invests. Here is BetaShares OZBD, the Australian Composite Bond ETF. Already you know what composite means. It has a fee of 0.19%, asterisk. What does that mean? I'll tell you about that in a minute, but bear that in mind. Of course, it's the AusBond Composite Index. And, well, we know it's composite, so here it goes. Diversified portfolio of Australian corporate and government bonds. Okay, we knew that already. I've noticed that particular ETFs are actually based on the same index. I kid you not. So I've sort of sorted them and grouped so you can see for yourself. This is VBND, which is a Vanguard Global Aggregate Bond Index Hedged. Okay, so our first international one, how do I know it's international? Well, it says global. Secondly, it says hedged, and you don't hedge Australian-only bonds. It makes absolutely no sense. Its management fee is 0.2%. Its benchmark is the Bloomberg, there we go again, Global Aggregate Float-Adjusted and Scaled Index Hedged into Australian dollars. And yes, I can say that in one breath. The ETF provides low-cost exposure, yes, to what? Government-owned entities, got you. Investment-grade corporate. There we go, that answers that question. So that becomes our first yes. So it's international, but how much does it have in Australia? Well, it's undefined. You'd have to actually go and look at the individual ETF, but it's not an ex-Australian ETF, and therefore it probably contains a certain percentage of Australian. I'll show you later on exactly one and how much it does include, but unless it specifically says ex-Australian, then we've got to assume it's international and Australian. Here is the Vanguard Ethically Conscious Global Aggregate Bond Indexed Hedged ETF, VEFI. Wow, that is a mouthful. It has a management fee of 0.26%. Is that management fee ethically conscious? That's what I'd like to know. Its benchmark is the Bloomberg MSCI Global Aggregate SRI Exclusion Float Adjusted Hedged into AUD Index. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I'm sorry. How about giving your index an actual name rather than giving it 27 descriptive terms? And by the time you've actually described that many terms, why do you have that many indices that you actually have to divvy up between the little micro amounts? Is this because you actually make money out of your indices and therefore the more you create, the better off it is for your business? Yes, that's the answer. So the ETF, what does it do? Global investment, right? Government and corporate. Gotcha. So it becomes a yes, 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 and its fee is 0.26, which is the highest so far. And they call that ethical. Onto the Vanguard International Credit Securities Index Hedged ETF. VCF is the code. Hedged, you know it's international. Its management fee is 0.30. Okay, that's worse than the last one. Its benchmark is a Bloomberg Global Aggregate Corporate and Government Related Scaled Index hedged into Australian dollars. So we already know what it does. It's international, it does government, and it does corporate. Bang, we don't really need to read the description. So it is a yes, 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 and I've noticed there's a second index that's actually named extremely similar to it. So you tell me, what's the difference between the Bloomberg Global Aggregate Corporate and the other one's float adjusted? Yes. Splitting hairs, I tend to think. Beta shares, AGVT, the Australian Government Bond ETF. Okay, so this definitely is not international, and it does not include corporates. I can tell you already based on the name. His management fee and cost is 0.22%. And remember those asterisks I said? Here it is. Certain additional costs apply. I've hidden it in the PDS, the product description statement, so you can't find it. That's exactly what the asterisk means. And remember, we found that on an earlier ETF as well. In my spreadsheet, I'll just actually write the figure they disclose, but be aware their overall fees are actually higher. So you need to investigate if you're interested in these particular ETFs. The index is a selective Australian government 7 to 10. Aha. Okay, so the bonds must have a maturity of 7 to 12 years, and it's a total return index, which is interesting. It can be issued by Australian federal and state government. 75% must come from that, and the 25% can come from supranatural, and we know what that means. That's institutions which are between countries. So that's a yes, no, 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 which is, I think, our first one. Yes, it is. Vanguard International Fixed Interest Index Hedged ETF. All right, so we already know it's international. Its management fee is 0.2%. Right. What we don't know is whether it has corporates as well. The Bloomberg Global Treasury Scaled Index. Okay. Income generating securities issued by governments across the world. Okay, that's what the Treasury is about. Does that include Australia? Well, let's have a look. See, the Pacific. It's got a lot from there. The Pacific actually is not that large as an economic force. So there it is, it's in now, it is hedged, it is international, and it doesn't include any corporates. This is BlackRock IGB, the iShares Treasury ETF, has a management fee of 0.18. So its index is the Bloomberg AusBond Treasury 0+ year index. So that is a yes, no, 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 because it actually doesn't involve corporates. The question is, what is the difference between the previous government one which we saw, which is the AGVT, and this one, the IGB? Well, it's all about the time frames. The selective Australian government 7 to 12, okay, that's the time frame, the maturity which they expect from their bonds, whereas the IGB has no such issue, 0+ year. Vanguard Australian Government Bond Index ETF, the symbol is VGB. It has a management fee of 0.2%. Well, we already know that you're into government. We know you're a 0+ fund. Okay, and that's all. So you are yes, no, no, no. Very good. Now, there is actually another one, the AusBond Treasury 0+ and the AusBond Government 0+. I mean, they're almost identical, except that one has got the word Treasury, the other's got the word government. What's the difference? Well, it works like this. Treasury means federal. Government means all government entities, which can include states. That is the difference. So the hunt for Australian bond ETFs is now over. Let's see what we've discovered. Well, if I sort by fees, I know IAF is actually at the top with 0.1%. VAF is second, and so on down the list. You'll also notice that all the international ones are hedged. So there's literally no international ones which are unhedged, which is curious. In stocks, there are actually hedged international ETFs, but there's also the unhedged version, and there's times when the unhedged version, but not the hedged version. But it seems with the bond funds, no, all the international ones, well, certainly the ones on our list, are 100% hedged. Interesting. There's also 3 which have exactly the same index. There's others which have very similar index, arguably more or less the same, but they're worded differently, so there must be some subtle difference. It is now time to perform a massive showdown of these 11 ETFs. Which one will win? Which one will reign supreme? But there is another, an official standard against which all bond ETFs should be measured. Bond funds are fixed interest, which means the interest rates don't go up and down, but most importantly, you're focusing on that interest rate. What else is basically an interest rate? a high interest savings account. The nice thing about a high interest savings account is you probably already have one, so it requires zero effort. Why are you looking for bonds if a high interest savings account actually is better? Well, we don't know that. But at the minimum, every bond fund that you may be interested in needs to be compared against your bank account. So let's do that right now. The high interest savings account, over 41 years. Wow, that's a lot of data and it's a very pretty graph. The interesting thing, it's never lost a cent. Ever. Whereas the Australian Bond Total Return Fund, well, okay, so that's lost money, hasn't it? Look at that. It's gained overall, but there's only been years when it's fallen right down. That's the risk with bonds. You think that bonds are stable? No, they're certainly not. You can definitely always lose money with bonds. I have a problem, and that is people are sneaking into my question queue. Yes, it's true. This means some people are getting their questions answered before other people. I know, I was shocked when I found out. What I've uncovered is some people are actually getting favoritism, and I want to know why. Here, take a look. Well, this is Mr. Steve OC who only asked his question 8 days ago, and suddenly I spin up a video for him. Well, that's a bit ridiculous. Oh, hang on. He's actually one of my channel members. And one of the perks of being one of my channel members is that you actually get taken through the back door and snuck up the queue. Ooh. If you want special access, like Mr. Steve OC, then you can become a channel member right now by hitting the join button below this video. Here's a list. It's got nothing on it. Oh, I see. The 1, the 3, the 5-year and the 10-year performance. And I notice at the top, high interest savings account. Right, so we're going to compare that against the bonds. The high interest savings account over 1 year, well, it's returned 3.92%. Very good. AGVT has returned over 1 year minus 10.42. Wasn't high interest savings account like close to 4%? Yes, it was. VBND has returned minus 7.64%. These aren't looking good. See what I mean about bonds? They can definitely lose your money. IAF returned minus 6.53%. IGB returned minus 7.03%. OZBD returned minus 8.07%. These are atrocious. VAF has performed minus 6.49%. VBND has returned minus 10.93%. Oh. Okay, if this was a stock fund, I'd have no problems. Stocks go up, they go up a lot, and of course they come down fairly steeply. But when it comes to bonds, so stable. Yes, I'm not impressed. VCF, minus 10.67%. These are atrocious. VEFI has returned minus 10.88%. Well, one thing I can say about them is they're all roughly equal failures. VGB, minus 7.09%. Oh, I guess you'll consider that you're doing well. VIF is minus 10.29%. Right, I've plot them on the list. I've actually sorted them by how much they earned. At the top is high interest savings account with 3.92%. Well, that's impressive, like really impressive. Look at all the failures below, right down to VBND right at the end. Bonds, I'm sure somebody's going to love them. Over to 3 years, a high interest savings account has returned a CAGR, a compound annual growth rate, of 2.04%. What's compound annual growth rate actually mean? I hear you say it so often in videos, Sebastian. What it means is you take the interest rate and then you multiply it by itself every single year, consistently over time, interest on top of interest. And that's how you get to the final figure. OZBD, well, it doesn't actually have a 3-year. Oh, so there you go. That stops at this point. Goodbye. If I show you screenshots of all the results, we'll be here all day. So I've compiled them off camera. And here they are. Yes, all down the list. Minus 99%. What does that mean? Well, that means it's no longer in service. I could actually delete it, but to keep it on the actual table, I've assigned it a minus 99%. Well, the winner is cash at 2.04%. It's the only thing that's positive, yes. VAF is second, IAF is next, and OZBD, well, okay, that doesn't count because it actually got kicked out. AGVT is right down the bottom at minus 5.63%. Over to the 5 years, the bank has returned 2.79%. Well, the winner there is cash. Oh, for the third time. Interesting. Oh, we got some positives. That's nice. VAF is second. IAF is next. Oh, and we've lost a few more. What have we lost? Well, we've lost VEFI, which has not been around for 5 years. We've lost AGVT. Okay. And that's gone. But of the remaining one, the bottom is VBND at 0.45%, although there's another one, VIF as well. Over to 10 years, the high interest savings account has returned 4.4%. And that makes it up the top for 10 years. And this is where we end, by the way, at the 10-year mark. So cash has won again. VAF is second. IAF is next. Oh, we've lost some more. Okay, BOND has gone. And a few more there you can see on the table. Wow. Well, they're very interesting results. So let me get this right. Based on the data that you've got here, I'm better off leaving my money in a high interest savings account and forgetting about bonds. Is that right? Well, let me show you the graph. This is Australian bonds total return. So total return means the coupons are being paid out versus the high interest savings account over 10.1 years. So this is Australian bonds versus Australian cash. In red, we have the cash, which has basically won right from the very beginning and has not stopped winning. Yeah, and then the bonds underneath have sadly dipped down recently. Over 10.1 years, the bonds has returned a total of 30.9%. High interest savings account has returned 54.4%, which means the bonds have a CAGR of 2.71% and the high interest savings account has 4.44%. Wow, okay, that's a bit of a difference there. So I presented the data. It is now time to draw some conclusions. So based on the data we have, high interest savings account won in every time period. So why haven't you got more than 10 years data? Because the ETFs don't give me more than 10 years. Most of them don't even give me more than 5 years. We saw the ones which all sort of dropped off. Some of them, particularly at the 5-year mark where they existed, the 10-year mark they didn't. They do exist. They've been around forever, but they just don't give out the 10-year data. High interest savings account, I can go back decades. I've got that data, but if the bond ETFs won't give me the data, well, that's as far as we can go. VAF, closely followed by IAF, were the overall winning bond ETFs. So there, what we found, there's some natural questions which might arise from that. Should I ditch bonds and use a high interest savings account instead? Well, that's one conclusion you could draw, but ultimately that is a you decision. I present the data. Obviously, there's some results and they're quite meaningful, but what you actually do is totally up to you. Would it be reasonable to ditch bonds and use high interest savings account instead? Well, yes, based on the data, that certainly would be a reasonable course of action. In this history, which is 10 years, it actually shows that high interest savings accounts have done particularly well and bonds have done particularly poorly relative to that. With more data, could we find that bonds outperform cash over the long term? Well, that's certainly possible. I need to get my hands on that data to prove it. The whole idea of this channel is not just to use broad statements that have been parroted from somebody else. I want to show you the real results and I want to show it based on real actual data. That is what I need in data. As my data set actually grows over time, I get access to even more data. I can show you longer periods of time and we can see for once and for all if bonds can actually step up to the plate or whether cash is always better than bonds. If you're interested in bonds, you might also be interested in dividends. What are the best Australian dividend stocks in 2023? Click here to find out. Or if you've seen that, click here.